And good morning, everybody, and welcome to our session today on water stewardship and how that relates to natural capital. This is the last in our series of natural capital webcasts that we're doing in the spring of 2016. This is part of the Green Leaders DC Natural Capital campaign. And today we're going to be speaking about perhaps the biggest natural capital asset of them all, and that's water. And with us today to talk a little bit about some of the issues and some of the methods that we use in conservation that not only benefit the environment, but also can help increase farm and ranching incomes, is Clay Pope, and he comes to us from Oklahoma. Clay, thanks for being with us.
Thank you very much for inviting me today. I appreciate it.
Okay, Clay, tell us a little bit about your background. Now, you've been a farmer and a rancher for a long time, and you've spent some time in Oklahoma politics as well. Tell us about that.
Well, I do farm and ranch for a living with my brother and my nephew. I've lived in Western Oklahoma my entire life. I'm a sixth generation agriculture producer from the western part of the state. I have worked in politics in Oklahoma. I spent a little time on Capitol Hill as a congressional aide to a gentleman who at that time was chairman of the Conservation, Credit, and Rural Development Subcommittee of the House Ag Committee, a gentleman named Glenn English. I did agriculture policy for him. Spent about 10 years in the Oklahoma legislature. Representing all of part of 6 counties in northwest Oklahoma. And then I worked for about 10 years as the executive director of the Oklahoma Association of Conservation Districts before striking out on my own with my wife. We set up a natural resources consulting firm, and we're working on an agreement right now through Redlands Community College, which is a small school here in central Oklahoma, that works with the Agricultural Research Service to facilitate the work of the Southern Plains Climate Hub. We're working with ARS and NRCS on this effort, and we're excited to be part of this work to try to help agriculture producers to come up with mitigation and adaptation strategies to deal with climate change and the natural resource problems that it exacerbates.
Okay, that's great. And like you said, I mean, you're working with the Southern Plains Hub of USDA's climate hubs. Now, the climate hubs, of course, serve a very important function as really a gateway for the farmers and the ranchers on the ground to get the information and the some of the support that they need to deal with the changes that we see in climate change. And now, when we talk about climate change, of course, water is right at the top of the list of concerns. And of course, this is a constant concern for anybody involved in farming and agriculture. So you're going to tell us now about some of the methods and some of the issues that you see in your region. So let's see your presentation.
All right. Well, and that's one of the things we're going to visit a little bit about is this connection between climate change and water issues, because really water is a climate change issue. I mentioned the issues that climate change exacerbates. As you said, water is one of the biggest challenges we have, especially in the southern plain states of Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas. But one of the things that we have found out, and that I think we need to keep in our minds as we move forward on these issues, is a lot of times the things that we are trying to deal with actually do fit together. And the title of my talk today is about how the secret is in the soil. If you want to fight climate change, clean up the water, feed the world, the secret really is under the soil. So many of the issues that we are staring in the face, the answer to them a lot of times really is right underneath our feet. To begin with, though, I do want to talk a little bit about USDA's strategy for addressing climate change. On the 23rd of April of last year, Secretary Vilsack announced the plan that he had for USDA. And just kind of you see here that the USDA will use the authorities in the Farm Bill and other programs to provide technical assistance and financial incentives to farmers and ranchers, forest landowners, and rural communities to help them to adapt to climate change and help mitigate some of climate change's root causes. Using the authority that we already have under the existing law, under the work that we've been doing since the days of the Dust Bowl, working together, the Secretary put together a strategy to help us move forward on the issues of climate change. And like I said, we can address a lot of this through existing USDA authority. The Secretary outlined his building blocks. There were 10 points that covered various areas, but the one we're going to talk a little bit about today and that we really have been focusing on in the Southern Plains is what we consider the low-hanging fruit of soil health and pasture land improvement. If you look at the Farm Bill, and this is one of the things I like to tell folks that they don't really think about, the Farm Bill wasn't discussed as climate change legislation, but in all honesty, the last Farm Bill that passed and was signed into law by President Obama, in my opinion, is without a doubt the most important piece of climate change legislation that's been passed by Congress up to this time, and that may be passed for the next decade. We have the responsibility and the authority to help agriculture producers to deal with a lot of the issues that climate change is bringing and bringing home to them, but also to help them mitigate some of climate change's root causes. And a lot of it we can do through soil health. And a lot of times when we think about the soil, we think of it as just plain old dirt. That's what so many people don't recognize the importance of the soil. But over the last couple of decades, we've come to understand how the soil and the health of the soil, especially the microbial community underneath the ground, interacts with the plants and the animals in the atmosphere above the land. And it's so important in issues like the water cycle, the nutrient cycle, and the carbon cycle, because what happens to the soil does have an effect on our water. Soil, water, and nearby streams and rivers. We know that we can have an impact. Again, you see this picture, we're all familiar with the issues as far as non-point source pollution is concerned, but how we treat the land and how we manage the land can have a huge impact. Challenge is, though, our soil is starving, naked, and has a fever. It's just not sustainable. Restoring the health of the soil is a key component in addressing many of these environmental problems. We've got to do a better job of protecting that resource if we are going to address these other issues. Now, why do you need to improve the health of the soil? What's the big deal? Well, we need to adapt or harden our agricultural system to climate change. We need to use what tools we have to help agriculture mitigate climate change as well. When you stop and think about, especially in the Southern Plains, when folks talk about climate change and agriculture, the guys with the crystal balls will tell you at the end of the day, basically the crazy weather we've always had is just going to get a little bit crazier. We've always had droughts and floods in the Southern Plains, but what we're going to see in the future, and what we're already seeing now, is we're seeing more variability in our rainfall patterns. When the water does come, we may get the same amount of rain, in fact, that we've seen in past years. It's just when it comes and the intensity that it comes with. Droughts. If you think about the droughts that we've seen in the past, obviously the Dust Bowl is one that we always harken back to in this part of the world. A lot of folks don't recognize that the drought of the 1950s was actually worse than the drought of the 1930s. And we've just come out last year of a drought that was worse than anything that we saw in the 1950s. And again, we're seeing that increase in intensity of these extreme weather events that we've always seen just becoming a little bit worse. We have to protect our water, both the quality and quantity. And that affects not just production agriculture, but the rural communities and the folks downstream. We've got to make sure that we have adequate water, not only to produce the food and fiber that we need to feed and clothe the world, but also for human consumption and industrial use. And we have to control soil erosion. We don't stop and think about how the loss of our soil, as far as being able to feed and clothe the world, is such a huge issue out there. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later. We have to help agriculture producers' bottom lines too if we're going to be sustainable. That again, when you're talking about adapting to climate change, agriculture is not a charity business. Folks are in it to make a living, and we have to make sure that they have the tools necessary to do that. At the end of the day, we need to increase organic matter. Now, why organic matter? Organic matter helps hold moisture together and helps reduce erosion and provides food and housing to the subsoil microbial community. Research has shown that a 1% increase in organic matter can triple the soil's water holding capacity, according to Kansas State. That's about 25,000 gallons on average per acre for growing crops. You think about it again, especially from some of the Southern Plains perspective, there's a saying around here, a lot more folks left this country because it was too dry than it was too wet. If we can hold on to every drop of moisture when it does hit our ground and make sure that we have that water available to produce the crops and the forage for livestock, that is a huge issue as far as adapting to climate change. That same 1% increase in organic matter, according to Ohio State, has been shown to make up to $700 of additional nutrients per acre available for growing crops. Earlier, I'd said that it provides food and housing for the subsoil microbial community. A lot of the research that we've seen over the last 10 to 20 years has shown that basically 60% of the fertilizer that we're putting down on the ground right now, if we don't have a healthy subsoil community of bacteria, bugs, and fungi to help the plants more readily take up those nutrients, we're basically throwing good money after bad. If we can increase the organic matter, we can increase fertilizer efficiency while at the same time increasing the water holding capacity of their soils. That has a huge ability as far as helping folks' bottom lines, but also helping them address one of the key challenges of climate change, which is, of course, surviving extreme droughts. This is the best way that we can harden agriculture to those extreme weather events. If we can do things to help folks, again, deal with extreme droughts, increase fertilizer efficiency, and help them more readily hang on to that moisture when it does hit, that is one of the best tools that we have moving forward to help agriculture deal with some of these issues. Now, if you stop and think about mitigating climate change, we're talking about adaptation. but we also want agriculture producers to help address some of climate change's root causes. Well, if you think about organic matter in the soil, roughly 50 to 60% of organic matter is nothing but organic carbon. Go back to high school biology. We all learned plants breathe in carbon dioxide and breathe out oxygen through photosynthesis. If you don't disturb the ground, that carbon dioxide is then sequestered in the form of organic matter down into the soil. In fact, if you look at some of the studies that are out there, no-till has been shown, no-till agriculture, stepping away from cultivation, using no-till farming practices, you can sequester around 0.5 metric ton of carbon dioxide per acre per year. And according to Oklahoma State University, at least to produce a winter wheat crop in the southern plains, no-till uses around 3 gallons of diesel less per acre per year than conventional tillage. That saves the agriculture producer money, but that's also less carbon dioxide and nitrous oxide that you're putting in the air to produce that crop. And according to the National Academy the National Academy of Sciences, Great Plains agriculture could be a net zero greenhouse gas emitter if 75% of the agriculture producers in the Great Plains region undertook soil health practices on their land. There's other studies out there that have shown that we could reduce the land use practices alone. Now, again, this is a high head cut number, and you would have to have folks across the globe working together to do these practices. But there are some folks that have estimated you could reduce anywhere from 20 to 25% of the greenhouse gas levels that we have today through improved soil health practices on the land that not only helps mitigate climate change, but also helps agriculture producers adapt to extreme weather events. Now, we were here to talk about water quality. If you look at some of the land use practices and the impact that it can have on water quality, I mentioned no-till and what it can mean as far as carbon sequestration and reduced diesel use. It can also help reduce erosion by over 90% and the phosphorus loads by over 60%. Now, cover crops, which is another thing that we're willing to do to improve the health of the soil, having rotations where we're having something green and growing on the year round, cover crops have been shown that they can cut nitrate loads in half. Pasture management can reduce sedimentation by nearly 50%, nitrogen loads by over 60%, and phosphorus loads by 70%. And buffer strips, restoring the riparian areas and taking highly erodible land and putting it back into grass can reduce nitrogen by over 80%. So these same practices that we want agriculture producers to do to harden their system to climate change and to help mitigate climate change also can have a huge impact on protecting and improving the quality of our water. We have to control erosion too. Now, this is something I mentioned, erosion, but the same things that we want to do to increase organic matter also help to reduce erosion. Now, these numbers here, I don't have a citation on because I actually did the math in my head on the Oklahoma numbers, and then a gentleman who I worked with the Northern Plains Hub did the numbers for Iowa. In Oklahoma today, if you look at what our erosion rates are under the Natural Resource Index for the state, and look at the acres that we have in production and the amount of wheat that we produce, we lose roughly 2.5 pounds of soil every year for every pound of wheat we produce. In Iowa, they lose roughly 2 pounds of soil for every pound of corn. And if you stop and think that it takes 500 years to create new topsoil, reducing erosion, it helps address non-point source pollution. But if we're just going to feed and clothe 9 billion people by mid-century, we have to protect that resource. And from an agriculture producer's perspective, that's the basis of all our wealth. When I talk to agriculture groups, a lot of times I tell them, if you're not doing things to help address soil erosion, do yourself a favor. Go down to the bank, take money out of your account, go to the creek, and start throwing dollar bills into the water. Because that's basically what you're doing. If you're not protecting your soil, you're losing the basis of your wealth. You're losing the basis of our productive capacity as a nation. And on top of that, if you think about how 90% of the bacteria and the nutrients that get into our water is tied to that soil profile or that soil particle. And when you consider in states like Oklahoma, our number one water quality problem is turbidity. I mean, just plain old dirt in the water. When you don't control erosion, you're increasing non-point source pollution. Plus the fact, as I mentioned earlier, if you're not restoring the organic matter in the soil, if you don't have a healthy microbial community underneath the ground, you're just throwing fertilizer away. So again, you might as well be taking money out of your savings account, your checking account, and just throwing it into the creek, because that's what you're doing. It doesn't help your bottom line. You're hurting yourself financially, and you're doing things to harm the environment when we can do things that actually bring these things together. Not only help your bottom line financially, but also help you do things that protect our water, that sequester carbon, and that also help as far as increasing your ability to survive some of the extreme weather events through climate change. Now, again, Improving soil health and fighting climate change can go hand in hand. As was mentioned, I'm here in Oklahoma. And I said I used to work for the conservation districts in Oklahoma, so I'm going to crow a little bit about some of the success that we have had in the state. A lot of people don't realize that Oklahoma has one of the most successful non-point source pollution programs in the nation. The state has taken over 50 streams off the 303D list using soil health practices like no-till, cover crops, grass planting, pasture management, and riparian restoration. They've been able to work together, and there's actually another 7 streams that will be coming off the 303D list this summer if everything holds together. Now, I skipped over a slide. I apologize for that. Oklahoma, when they did do their water quality projects, they also found out that those same practices were sequestering carbon dioxide in the soil. At one time, Oklahoma had enrolled over 50,000 acres in a state-run carbon sequestration program. Oklahoma, at one time, had the state's only state statute on the books that gave a state agency the ability to verify carbon credits on behalf of that state, and that was the Oklahoma Carbon Program. Excuse me. And like I said, at one time, over 50,000 acres were enrolled in that program. And if you look at the success stories in taking streams off the 303D list, in 2015, there were 3 streams that were taken, three stream segments in the state of Oklahoma that were taken off of that impaired streams list. We ran the numbers on those streams using the Comet Planner tool, which is a tool that USDA NRCS has put together to estimate the carbon dioxide reduction amounts from farming and ranching practices. And in 2015, those 3 success stories, again, improvements in water quality, taken off the 303D list for bacteria and turbidity, they also reduced greenhouse gas levels by over 35,000 tons of CO2 equivalent. Now that's roughly a little over 7,500 cars going off the road every year on projects that were done through agricultural practices that not only improve water quality, but also improve the health of the soil. Now, as I said, most of those carbon acres are water quality acres. And all of this is what's important, was done through voluntary, locally led, popular programs. EPA 319 was involved in it, but also the Farm Bill programs through NRCS, the Farm Services Agency through their PREP program, working together through voluntary programs. We've been able to do things in Oklahoma that not only address non-point source pollution, but also help fight climate change. And I mentioned that these are voluntary and locally led. I think it's important to note there's never been a water quality initiative undertaken in the state of Oklahoma through the 319 program where we haven't had to turn farmers back. We always run out of money before we run out of agriculture producers that are willing to participate. Because when the state goes out and talks to these folks, when the local conservation districts go out and work with these individuals, and then in partnership with their local district conservationists through NRCS, they're basically talking to folks and say, look, we can help you improve your bottom line. We can help you improve fertilizer efficiency. We can help you save diesel costs. We can help you do things to control erosion. But guess what? It's also going to have these other benefits for society. By doing it through a voluntary, locally led way, we can get people to sign up and do things and have a real positive impact on the environment while also helping their bottom lines. Now, how do we do that? It sounds like it ought to be as confusing as all get out as to how you would do it. So that's why I put this on here. You think this has got to be some kind of crazy bureaucratic mumbo jumbo. Well, what do we want producers to do to improve the health of the soil? Primarily in this part of the world, convert to no-till. Plant cover crops, do better pasture management, plant grass on highly erodible land. That's what we want them to do primarily to improve the health of the soil. Now, what do we want them to do to harden their operations to climate change? Sort convert to no-till, plant cover crops, better pasture management, plant grass on highly erodible acres. Now, what do we want them to do to mitigate climate change? You can start to see a theme develop. What do we want them to do to address non-point? Well, again, no-till, cover crops, better pasture management, plant grass on highly erodible land. And, at the end of the day, that not only helps as far as addressing non-point source pollution and climate change, it also helps with stream flow. Because if we can get the water cycle back into balance, I mentioned that 1% increase in the water holding capacity of the soil. If we can start to get that water cycle back into balance, that also helps with intermittent stream flow, which helps with wildlife habitat and helps for the availability of water downstream. So again, all these things are tied together. And we've got to keep all this in mind because, again, when our resources are gone, they're gone. Cleopatra may very well have bathed in the coffee that you're drinking right now, and Columbus was in diapers when the topsoil that we're farming out there in western Oklahoma started to form. When it's gone, it's gone. All the water that's ever been or ever will be is already here today. We've got to take care of it. We've got to feed 9 billion people by mid-century. And if we're losing topsoil that on average it takes 500 years to restore, we're not going to be able to do that, especially not do it in a way that doesn't rape and pillage our natural resource base, especially on a declining resource base that we are dealing with, unless we do things that are more sustainable and improve the health of the soil. And the thing about it, when you're talking to agriculture producers, I've mentioned that when we go out and talk to folks about water quality, a lot of times we do talk about the economic benefits that for them and how it benefits their operation. That's one of the things too about soil health. When you're talking to individuals about trying to adapt to climate change, folks don't have to believe in climate change to believe in droughts and floods. At the end of the day, we've seen droughts and floods before. We've seen extreme weather events before. Folks know that they've got to do things to better harden their system to extreme weather events, to harden extreme flash floods. They also understand that droughts are going to come. A lot of times, the things that we see in production, agriculture, and the environment have a tendency to butt heads. But this is one place where I think for a little while at least, we all can come around the fire and sing kumbaya. There is a real interest in trying to address these, both from the economic bottom lines of agriculture producers and our need to protect the environment, to improve our water quality, and make sure we have those resources for future generations. There is common ground. And, that's the other thing when we're talking to agriculture producers. A lot of times people say, well, we don't think man can have that big of an impact on nature. When you're talking about climate change, can we really have the impact that we are having? I always tell them, look at the Dust Bowl. Coming from Oklahoma, that's part of that's kind of the seminal event in our state's history, the Dust Bowl of the 1930s. Folks really don't understand the impact, unless you live through it or really study it. Maybe you watched the Ken Burns documentary a couple years ago. Folks really don't understand the impact that man's farming practices had on the land in the 1930s. In this part of the world, there were dust storms that would start in places like West Texas, Western Oklahoma, Western Kansas, that would hold together and actually cover ships 300 miles out in the Atlantic Ocean with dust that started from the Great Plains. I always like to tell the story about in the middle of the testimony of a gentleman by the name of Hugh Hammond Bennett on the creation of the original Soil Conservation Act. In the middle of his testimony, the street lights came on in Washington, D.C., and it became as dark that afternoon as it would be that night in the nation's capital, because a dust storm that had started again on the southern plains of the United States had held together and blown all the way to our nation's capital, and it engulfed the city in a cloud of dust. The next day, FDR said he could put his fingers on his desk, rub his fingers on his desk, and hold Oklahoma in his hand. We were having a huge impact on this part of the world. We were doing desertification on an industrial scale. And if you look at places in the Middle East, the Fertile Crescent, that's another thing I like to say. You think about all the fighting that our boys and girls have had to do in places like Iraq. Pictures on television, I don't know about you, it doesn't look too fertile to me. But that's the breadbasket of the ancient world. Man can have a negative impact on the land, and it in turn has an impact on society. But the good news is we stopped the Dust Bowl. I mentioned earlier that the droughts of the 50s were worse than the droughts of the 30s, and how the drought that we just came out of was worse than the drought of the 1950s. We had some dirt blowing. We've had some problems. But I don't think anybody in New York or Washington, D.C. has seen street lights come on in the afternoon because Midwest topsoil is blown all the way to the East Coast. We were able to turn back the tide of dust, and we did it using the authority that USDA had. Those locally led, voluntary, incentive-based programs coming with that open hand of friendship instead of the iron fist of regulation. We were able to do things to help agriculture producers turn back that tide of the dust and ensure that these acres stayed in a productive manner so that we can continue to feed and clothe the world. Now, climate change is different than the Dust Bowl, but I think there is a correlation between the two. We could work together and find common ground to stop that natural catastrophe. I believe we can do the same with climate change, and not only help address climate change, but also all those issues that climate change exacerbates, especially in the area of water quality. And talk a little bit about the Southern Plains Hub, just real quick to put in a plug for what we are doing in this effort. One of the big things that we are trying to do at the Hub is trying to build awareness through outreach. We've been fostering partnerships. We've been working extremely hard on demonstration farms to have a place where we could show agriculture producers what these practices mean for them in their local area. It's one thing to have someone who's done research or to have an expert from Oklahoma City or, heaven forbid, Washington, D.C. come out and talk to someone in rural Oklahoma about what they need to do on their land. But if they can go out and see it firsthand on another agriculture producer's place, talk to them, learn what works, learn what doesn't work, that makes a huge difference in disseminating that information and fostering acceptance of some of these practices that, quite frankly, are a little bit revolutionary. I mentioned no-till. We're less than 20% no-till in the Southern Plains in agriculture production. And of that 20% that's no-till, probably less than 20% of that uses cover crops. And a lot of it is because of misinformation and preconceived notions. Cover crops, perfect example. I was told my whole life, you don't want to plant anything in the summer in western Oklahoma because it'll suck all the moisture up out of the ground. Well, that's not the case. In fact, if you can keep that cover on the ground, you can reduce the evaporation rate, you can cool the soil, you can increase the water holding capacity of that soil, increase infiltration rate, and actually have the exact opposite effect of what you thought. So showing people that, letting them see it firsthand is a huge part of what we're trying to do. And identifying and highlighting the bundled benefits of existing USDA and partner programs. I mentioned earlier the 3 watersheds in Oklahoma that went off of the 303D list and showed the amount of CO2 equivalent that's being pulled out of the air annually through those practices, according to Comet Planner. That was one of the studies that we've done in the Southern Plains. We're going to try to expand that into some other areas on some other USDA programs in the future, trying to get some watersheds in Kansas and Texas to show the benefits that are going on. Because another thing about those 3 watersheds that went off the 303D list, all of those practices were done under Farm Bill conservation title programs. EPA 319 provided the money to do the monitoring, provided with some of the staff to help with outreach, but at the end of the day, those water quality improvements were primarily done through Farm Bill programs that a lot of those producers, if not all of those producers, were doing them for reasons other than water quality. And I think that's important to point out, that when someone undertakes a practice, there are multiple benefits that go along with it. Now, some people will say, well, if you're doing that for another reason, you're not doing it for water quality or climate change, are we getting any benefit? And I always like to tell them the story. It's like, well, if I go to my doctor, I like to drink beer and eat chicken fried steak. And I may go to my doctor and my doctor says, Clay, you got to lose weight because you're drinking too much beer and eating too much chicken fried steak. If you don't, you're going to have a heart attack. Well, I really don't care what my doctor says. I'm still going to drink beer and eat chicken fried steak. But if I go home and my wife beats me at the door and says, Clay, I don't like the way you look because you're getting too fat because you're drinking too much beer and eating chicken fried steak, that's a problem. By dang, I'll try to lose weight because she's mad. Now, if I lose weight to make my wife happy, that also makes sure that I'm not going to have the heart attack. So who cares why somebody makes a change, as long as they make a change that we do get good benefit from. And that's something that we're trying to do in this region. And we also are trying to foster research that is related to the Southern Plains, because I mentioned earlier, we are about 20% or less no-till. A lot of the work that's been done on soil health has been done in the upper Midwest. There are specifics that are different from place to place. And if you look at a state like Oklahoma, we have more distinct ecoregions than any other state in the union, with the exception of California. It's not only trying to take something that was developed in Iowa and replicate it in Oklahoma. It's trying to take something that was replicated in developed in the high plains of northwest Oklahoma and transfer it to the cypress swamps of southeast Oklahoma. So we've got a lot of work to do, because when you're dealing with states like Oklahoma, Texas, and Kansas, there is a lot of diversity, and we've got some work to do to make sure that we do have the information necessary to help producers deal with these issues. You know, and again, if I'm going to leave you with last, just to kind of sum up real quick, many of the same practices that we want farmers to use to adapt to climate change also fight climate change. And I think that's important to understand. What we do to adapt also helps us to fight some of climate change's root causes. The same practices that reduce farm-related non-point source pollution on our streams and rivers are also the same things that we want them to do to adapt to climate change and to help mitigate climate change. These same practices can benefit stream flow for our towns and cities downstream, and in short, helping agriculture producers to adapt to climate change improves the situation for all of us as we continue to see this issue manifest itself and its effects manifest itself across the country. Soil health is not going to solve all the problems of the world, but you know, you always want to kill 2 birds with 1 stone. Well, this is a big rock that does take a whack out of the flock. It's not going to kill everything. It's not going to solve all the problems. But if we can improve the health of our soil, we can do a lot to get us down the road to help agriculture not only adapt to climate change, but also mitigate the root causes of climate change while we also protect our supply and quality of our water. And, again, like I said earlier, so many times agriculture and the environment are described as being on opposite sides of the equation. I contend when we're dealing with this issue that, again, this ought to be the one place where we can all come together for a little while and find common ground. And I think that's really what we need to understand is we need to find that area where there is common ground, not try to fight all the time, and actually do things that can help us all move forward, because there is a way to do it. And for those folks who may not necessarily believe in climate change, I love this slide. Because at the end of the day, what if it is a hoax? We just made a better world for nothing. From agriculture, if you don't believe in climate change, well, we helped you deal with droughts. We helped you deal with flash floods. We helped improve your bottom line. We helped you improve fertilizer efficiency. We've done things that we know are good for the quality and quantity of the water. So at the end of the day, everybody wins. Regardless of what you believe, where you want to fight, there is common ground. There is a place where we can all come together. So, and real quick, for the statements that I made as far as the findings, as far as the benefits of soil health and a lot of these practices, these are the references. It's available on the PowerPoint. If anybody wants to copy these references, I'd be more than happy to provide it. So there we go. How's that?
There you are. Welcome back.
And that's my presentation. I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Okay, great.